It was the third Saturday of September 1987, and the fairgrounds at Adair County, Iowa smelled like diesel smoke, deep-fried pork tenderloin, and the particular kind of tension that only comes when a man is about to be publicly embarrassed. 400 people lined the fence rails of the county tractor pull, farmers in seed company caps, their wives in windbreakers, kids up on their fathers' shoulders to see over the crowd. And right there in the middle of the staging lane, under the loudspeakers crackling with Merle Haggard, sat a 1954 Farmall Super M that looked like it had been dragged in from a scrapyard. The paint was so faded you could barely read the red. One headlight had a crack across the lens. The rear tires were mismatched, one Firestone, one Goodyear, and the exhaust stack was nothing but a 6-inch piece of black iron pipe somebody had welded on crooked, maybe 20 years ago. And sitting up on that tractor, straight-backed and steady, was a 61-year-old man named Eldon Pruitt. Let me tell you about what happened next. Greenfield, Iowa, population 4,200, seat of Adair County, stuck right in the middle of Iowa like a thumbtack on a map. In 1987, the farm crisis that had been steamrolling through the Midwest for 3 years was starting to ease its grip, barely, but you could still feel it in the air at a gathering like this. Half the farms in a 50-mile radius had changed hands since 1984. Some hadn't changed hands so much as they'd simply been swallowed by the bank. The Adair County Fair tractor pull was one of those traditions that survived everything: drought, depression, 2 world wars. It had been running every September since 1931, and it wasn't just entertainment. Out here, a tractor pull was a referendum. It was a community saying, here is what we value: strength, endurance, ingenuity. The idea that a man could take a machine apart, understand every bolt in it, and put it back together better than it came from the factory. The 1987 pull had 22 entries in the modified class, the class where you could run any tractor built before 1970, modified however you pleased, under 10,000 pounds. The purse was $450 for first place. Not life-changing money, but the kind of money that meant something to a man who'd been watching his margins shrink for 3 years straight. The big rigs had already gone through, the new John Deere 4850s, the Case IH Magnums. Crowds whooped. Engines screamed. 5-figure tractors with injectors the size of a man's fist. That was the show everyone had paid to see. The modified class was supposed to be the comedy act at the end. Eldon Pruitt had farmed the same 440 acres in western Adair County since 1958, when he came home from 2 years with the Army Corps of Engineers and bought the place from his uncle for $31,000, every penny of it borrowed. His daddy had farmed 30 miles east in Goodyear County. His grandfather had broken sod in this part of Iowa when it was still raw prairie, pulling a walking plow behind a team of Belgians. Eldon was not a tall man, 5'9" maybe, in his boots. He had the kind of hands that told his whole biography: wide across the palm, knuckles like walnut shells, fingers permanently stained at the creases with grease that no amount of lava soap would fully remove. He'd had a piece of his left index finger taken off by a PTO shaft in 1963 and never once mentioned it unless you noticed it yourself. He grew corn and soybeans, same as everyone around him. He kept a small herd of Angus crosses on the back 80. He drove a 1971 Ford pickup with 212,000 miles on it and an AM radio that only received one station clearly, WSB, out of Creston, which played country music from 6 in the morning until they switched to farm reports at noon. What Eldon Pruitt was, at his core, was a mechanic. Not a shade tree mechanic, not a guy who could change his own oil and thought that made him clever. A real mechanic. The kind who could listen to an engine running and tell you which cylinder was misfiring, what the timing was off by, and what it was going to cost you if you ignored it another season. He'd learned it in the Army Corps, working on heavy equipment in Korea, and he'd spent the 30 years since then applying every bit of that education to the machines on his own farm. He had never bought a new tractor, not once in 29 years of farming. His newest piece of iron was a 1966 Oliver 1850 he'd picked up from an estate sale in 1978 for $800. His main workhorse, the tractor he planted with, cultivated with, hauled with, was a 1954 International Harvester Farmall Super M. He'd bought it for $400 in 1961 from a neighbor who thought it was worn out. Eldon had driven it home, pulled the engine, and spent 14 months rebuilding it from scratch. That Super M had been running ever since, 26 years of running. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known a man like Eldon Pruitt? A man who didn't talk much, but when he did, the room got quiet. If you have, you already know exactly what kind of story this is. Let me tell you about Dale Whitmore. Dale Whitmore was 44 years old in 1987, and he had been the owner of Whitmore Implement Co. in Greenfield since 1979, when he'd bought out the old Larson dealership with money from his father-in-law and a John Deere franchise that had cost him $112,000 to secure. He sold new John Deere equipment, tractors, combines, planters, and he had done very well at it during the boom years of the late 70s, when every farmer in Adair County was leveraging himself to the hilt to expand. The farm crisis had actually been good for Dale Whitmore in ways he tried not to advertise. When farmers couldn't pay their notes, the banks foreclosed, and when banks foreclosed, they sold the equipment cheaply to whoever had cash. Dale Whitmore had cash. He'd spent 1984 and 1985 buying up used iron at 10 cents on the dollar and reselling it at a very comfortable markup. He drove a 1987 GMC Sierra Classic with the full trim package, power windows, leather, and a CB radio he used mostly to tell people how busy he was. He wore the same thing to the tractor pull that he wore to church, pressed khaki slacks, a button-down with his dealership logo embroidered on the left chest, and a John Deere cap with a gold dealer pin on the brim. He was not technically a farmer. He sold to farmers. He considered this a step up. Dale Whitmore had entered the 1987 Adair County Fair pull with a 1969 John Deere 4020 that had been modified so thoroughly it barely resembled its factory self. New cylinder head, bored and stroked to 480 cubic inches, a turbocharger from a Caterpillar diesel, high-compression pistons. He'd had the work done at a diesel shop in Des Moines at a cost of just over $6,000. He'd bragged about every dollar of it. Dale Whitmore was the kind of man who confused spending money with knowing things. The trouble started at the registration table. Eldon had walked up with his entry form filled out in pencil, same as he'd done the 6 previous years he'd entered the pull, and the woman at the table, Carol Heineman, who'd been running fair registration since 1974, took his form and stamped it without a word. Entry number 17. Farmall Super M 1954. 7,640 pounds on the scale. Dale Whitmore was standing 6 feet away when this happened, and he laughed. Not a short laugh. A laugh that started in his chest and brought a couple of his buddies in with it, 2 implement salesmen from Des Moines who were there for the weekend. A Super M, Dale said, loud enough for the whole registration area to hear. Eldon, is that the same Super M you've been driving since Kennedy was in office? I thought you were going to retire that thing after the bicentennial. Eldon looked at him. He had a way of looking at people that wasn't hostile exactly but wasn't warm either. It was just steady, like a man checking a fence line. She runs, Eldon said. She runs, Dale repeated, and the salesman laughed again. Eldon, I got a 4020 in the staging lane with a cat turbo and $6,000 in machine work. You understand what that means? I'm going to pull that sled to the end of the track and come back and ask them if they want me to do it again. And you're in here entering a 33-year-old stock tractor. Modified class, Eldon said. What's that? I'm in the modified class, same as you. Dale Whitmore looked at the Super M sitting in the staging lane, looked at the mismatched tires, the crooked exhaust pipe, the faded red paint. He shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's trying to appear patient while actually enjoying himself enormously. Eldon, with all due respect, modified means you put some work into it. What you do, put a new air filter on, change the points. Another round of laughter from the salesman. A few people nearby had turned to watch. Nobody defended Eldon. That wasn't because they didn't like him, they did. It was because arguing with Dale Whitmore was like arguing with the weather. It cost you energy and changed nothing. Eldon Prout folded his copy of the entry form, put it in the chest pocket of his coveralls, and walked back to his tractor without another word. By the time the modified class was called to the line, 400 people were there to watch. Most of them were expecting Dale Whitmore's green machine to dominate. A few of the older men in the crowd, men Eldon's age, men who'd grown up with International Harvester red on their own places, watched the Super M with quiet interest. They could see that something was different about it. They weren't sure what yet. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room or a fairground or a bank and been dismissed before you ever opened your mouth? If you know that feeling, hold on to it, because what comes next is for you. What Dale Whitmore didn't know, what almost nobody at that fairground knew, was what Eldon Prout had been doing in his machine shed for the past 4 years. Let me tell you about the Super M engine. The International Harvester Farmall Super M came from the factory with a C264 engine, a 4-cylinder inline, 264 cubic inches of displacement, rated at about 54 horsepower at the PTO. Good engine for 1954. Solid, reliable, simple to work on. But nothing that was going to scare a turbocharged 4020 in 1987. Unless, in 1959, the Army Corps of Engineers had published an internal technical bulletin, number 5914, covering high-altitude diesel performance on earth-moving equipment that contained a section on volumetric efficiency in naturally aspirated engines. It was dense, technical, and written for engineers. Eldon had gotten a copy from a buddy still serving in 1960 and had read it 3 times. The principle it described was not complicated, but it was precise. In a naturally aspirated engine, power could be substantially increased not just by adding displacement, but by engineering the intake and exhaust paths to maximize the volume of air entering and leaving each cylinder during each combustion cycle. Better breathing, higher volumetric efficiency. More air meant more fuel meant more power without a turbo, without supercharging, without anything the rulebook could flag as prohibited. Eldon had spent 4 years, 4 winters, every spare evening from October to March, did exactly this to his Super M. He had hand-ported the cylinder head. Every intake and exhaust port was shaped with a die grinder and polished by hand until they were mirror smooth. He had installed a high-lift camshaft he'd had custom ground in Omaha by a man named Ray Pilowski, who'd been building racing cams since 1951. He had rebuilt the carburetor with larger jets and a modified float bowl. He had fabricated a new intake manifold from scratch, cut, bent, and welded from Schedule 40 steel pipe. That reduced the intake charge path by 11 inches and eliminated 2 unnecessary bends that had been robbing him of airflow. He had balanced the rotating assembly himself on a home-built balancing fixture he'd welded up from an old disc harrow shaft. He had decked the block to tighten the combustion chamber and raised the compression ratio from 6.51 to 8.2, still running on regular fuel but right at the edge. The Super M that sat in the staging lane at the 1987 Adair County Fair had the same engine number it had left Farmall Works with in Rock Island, Illinois in February of 1954. It had the same block, the same crankshaft, the same connecting rods. By the rulebook, it was a stock engine. It was not a stock engine. Eldon had never entered it in competition before because it had taken him 4 years to feel certain he was done. He was not a man who was in a hurry. He had watched Dale Whitmore win the modified class at the same pull for 2 straight years with that 40-20, and he had said nothing, and he had kept working. He had decided 1987 was the year. What did that Super M put out? Eldon never had it dynoed. He didn't believe in paying someone to tell him what he already knew by feel. But the man at the cam shop in Omaha, Ray Pilowski, who knew engines the way a doctor knows bones, had told him, based on the cam specs and the headwork, that the engine should develop somewhere between 95 and 110 horsepower at the flywheel. The stock Super M made 54. The modified 40-20 across the staging lane made, by Dale Whitmore's own estimate, 160. Eldon knew he probably wasn't going to beat the 40-20 in raw horsepower. He'd known that all along. His plan wasn't to overpower it. His plan was to outrun it on weight-to-power ratio, on the efficiency of every mechanical connection between his engine and that sled, on the precision of every adjustment he'd made to the drivetrain. The Super M weighed 5,960 pounds running. The 40-20, by the time Whitmore had it on the scale, came in at 9,180, over his class limit, which cost him a mandatory 100-pound weight penalty added to the sled. Eldon's Super M checked in at 7,640 pounds. Under limit, not by accident. The modified class ran in reverse entry order. Eldon drew 17, which meant he ran near the end. Dale Whitmore had drawn 11, which put him in the middle of the pack. Let me tell you about that September afternoon. It was warm for September, 81 degrees, low humidity, a southwest wind carrying the smell of cut corn from the fields 2 miles away. The track was dry clay, packed hard from 2 weeks without rain, and it kicked up a fine reddish dust every time a tractor hooked to the sled and the tires started spinning. The announcer was a man named Larry Binford who'd been calling pulls since 1968, and he had that particular voice, part carnival barker, part farmer's wife at a church potluck, that could make a 10-foot pull sound like an act of God. Entries 1 through 10 went through without anything remarkable. A 1965 Alice Chalmers 190 got a good pull, 212 feet, solid applause. A 67 Oliver 1800 threw a front wheel weight into the infield, and the crowd made the noise crowds make when something almost goes badly wrong but doesn't. Then Dale Whitmore rolled entry number 11 to the line. That 40-20 sounded like money, no other way to put it. Whitmore had the exhaust stacked straight up, uncapped, and when he blipped the throttle at the line, the turbo came in with that particular whistle-then roar that tells you an engine is making serious boost. 200-pound women in lawn chairs 300 feet away felt it in their sternum. Kids on the fence rail pressed forward. Entry 11, Larry Binford called. Dale Whitmore, Greenfield, Iowa, 1969 John Deere 40-20 modified class, sled weight 16,000 pounds. Let's see what she'll do, folks. The sled hooked, the flag dropped, Whitmore buried the throttle. Those rear tires, 20.838 duals, brand new, still had the mold flash on the lugs, threw clay 6 feet in the air, and the 40-20 lunged forward like it was angry about something. The sled's weight transfer box shifted, adding progressive resistance, and Whitmore fought it straight down the track with the turbo screaming. He passed the 100-foot mark. The 150-foot mark hit 200 feet with the engine still singing, 220. Somewhere past 230, the front end started to lighten up, and at 241 feet, the tires broke loose completely and the pole judge threw the flag. 241 feet. The crowd was on its feet. Whitmore made a slow loop at the end of the track, waving from the seat with both hands, and pulled back into the staging area to a standing ovation. He climbed down and found his salesman friends, and they were already cracking cans of Pabst, and somebody was writing 241 in large numbers on a piece of cardboard. "That's the number to beat, boys," Dale Whitmore said, and he was right. For the next 4 entries, nobody came within 60 feet of it. Entry 17, Eldon Pruitt. He drove the Super M to the line without hurry. The crowd noise settled to a murmur, not hostile, not encouraging, just uncertain. A few people near the fence were visibly curious. Most were politely ready to watch the old man make his pull and get out of the way. Larry Binford read the card. Entry 17, Eldon Pruitt, Rural Greenfield, 1954 International Farmall Super M Modified Class, sled weight 16,000 pounds. Okay folks, let's give this one a hand. The applause was kind, polite, the kind you give the kid at the school play who has one line. Eldon sat on that tractor and did what he always did before starting something important. He was still for a moment, not nervous, not performing, just settling into himself. He set the throttle, not wide open, not yet. He'd worked out his throttle management on paper 3 winters ago based on what he knew about the torque curve of that modified engine. Peak torque came in low, around 1,400 RPM, and fell off sharply above 2,000. He was not going to redline this engine. He was going to ride the torque band. The pull judge hooked the sled, the flag went up. And that Super M made a sound unlike anything that crowd had heard all afternoon. It didn't scream, it didn't whistle. It didn't make the dramatic turbocharged shriek of the 4020. It made a deep, even almost musical bellow, 4 cylinders firing in a rhythm so perfectly timed it sounded like one long, sustained note. The exhaust pipe, that crooked 6-inch home-welded exhaust pipe, pulsed with every firing, and the sound that came out of it was the sound of an engine working at the exact center of its capability. The flag dropped. Eldon brought the throttle up smooth and steady, and those mismatched rear tires, the Firestone on the left, the Goodyear on the right, bit into the clay, and the Super M moved. At 50 feet, the murmur in the crowd started to change pitch. At 100 feet, people who had been talking stopped talking. At 150 feet, someone in the crowd said "Lord Almighty" out loud, and people around him nodded. At 200 feet, the sled was working hard against that little tractor, and Eldon had his body low and his hands steady on the wheel, and the Super M was pulling straight and clean as a drawn line, not hunting, not breaking loose, not asking for more than it had, just working. The way a good plow horse works. The way a man works when he knows his job and loves it and doesn't need anyone to tell him he's doing it right. 220 feet. 230. 240. 241 feet. The mark Dale Whitmore had set with a $6,000 engine in a 9,000-pound tractor, and Eldon Pruitt's Super M was still pulling. 250 and 260. At 273 feet, the front end of the Super M lifted, not breaking loose, just lightening up with the weight transfer, and the pull judge threw the flag. 273 feet. 32 feet past the 4020, with an engine that had been built in 1954, with a tractor that had cost $400 in 1961. Let me tell you about the silence. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It wasn't the silence of people trying to figure out what they'd just seen. They knew exactly what they'd seen. 400 people who spent their lives around tractors and engines and the particular arithmetic of horsepower and load, they understood precisely what had just happened at 273 feet. It was the silence of being corrected. The silence of a story you'd been telling yourself about new versus old, about money versus knowledge, about the future eating the past, being quietly, firmly, publicly revised. Eldon made his loop at the end of the track. He drove the Super M back to the staging line at the same speed he'd driven it to the start, no faster, no slower. He switched off the engine and climbed down from the seat with the same care a man takes getting off a ladder. He stood beside the tractor for a moment with one hand on the rear fender, the way you might rest a hand on the shoulder of someone who'd done well. The applause started slowly. Then it was built. By the time Eldon was walking toward the pull committee's table, it was loud, not the performed enthusiasm of a crowd at a stadium, but the unplanned, involuntary kind that comes from people who genuinely did not expect what they witnessed and are still catching up to it. Dale Whitmore was standing in the staging area with his 2 salesman friends and the cardboard sign that had said 241 on it. One of the salesmen had set his can of Pabst down on a fence post. Nobody was picking it back up. Dale Whitmore said nothing. For once in his life at a public event in Adair County, Dale Whitmore said absolutely nothing. The pool committee announced the winner. Eldon collected his envelope, $450 in cash, and put it in the same coverall pocket where he'd put the entry form. A man named Harlan Gruber, who farmed 4 miles north of Eldon and had known him for 30 years, walked over and shook his hand without saying a word, and Eldon nodded, and that was the ceremony. I want you to think about something right here. Think about every time someone has written you off because of your age or what you drive or where you come from or how much money you have. And then think about what Eldon did with that. He didn't argue. He didn't post about it. He went home and worked. Let me tell you what happened in the years after. The following Monday morning, a man named Gerald Hestetter drove out to Eldon's farm. Gerald farmed 620 acres in the eastern part of the county and had been watching his equipment costs eat him alive for 2 years. He'd heard about the pull from his brother-in-law who'd been there. He wanted to know if Eldon would look at his Oliver 1855. The engine was running rough and a dealer in Winterset had quoted him $850 for a valve job. Eldon looked at it. The valves were fine. The issue was a plugged fuel filter and a loose ignition wire. He fixed it in 40 minutes. Gerald tried to pay him and Eldon told him $60 for the time, nothing for the parts, and sent him home. Gerald told everyone he knew. By November of 1987, Eldon Prout had more repair work than he could handle. Farmers from 3 counties were driving out to his place. He wasn't charging what the dealers charged. He wasn't even trying to. He charged what the work was worth to him, which was never very much, and he turned away work he didn't have time for, and he didn't advertise, and he kept farming his 440 acres right alongside the repair work. In 1991, his son Calvin, who'd been working on road construction in Ames, came home to help. Not because the farm was in trouble. The farm was fine. Because Calvin had seen enough of the world to understand that what his father had built on those 440 acres in Adair County was something worth coming back to. They never incorporated, never put a sign at the end of the driveway. The business, if you could call it that, was still just word of mouth in 2017, when Eldon was 91 years old and Calvin was 63, and they had between them rebuilt more engines and salvaged more pieces of vintage iron than either of them could have named if you'd asked. The Super M is still on the farm. It still runs. Calvin uses it for light tillage work in the garden plots near the house. The mismatched tires were finally replaced in 2004 when Goodyear gave up, and he put 2 matching Firestones on it. The exhaust stack is still crooked. As for Dale Whitmore, the dealership ran until 2003, when the John Deere corporate franchise restructuring of that year required a capital investment he couldn't make. He sold the franchise to a larger operation in Creston and retired to a house in Des Moines. By most accounts, he wasn't unhappy. He'd made money. He'd done well enough. He just never again entered a tractor pull in Adair County. And if the subject of the 1987 modified class came up at a gathering, which it did from time to time, he would usually discover he had somewhere else to be. Eldon Prout passed away on February 14, 2019. He was 93 years old. The obituary in the Adair County Tribune listed him as a farmer, a veteran, and a machinist. It was 3 paragraphs long. Every person who attended the service at the First United Methodist Church in Greenfield could have filled 3 pages with things it didn't say. The pull record, 273 feet, 1954 Farmall Super M, modified class, stood for 11 years before it was broken in 1998 by a man from Union County who'd heard about Eldon's run and used it as his benchmark. He said later in an interview with a farm magazine that he figured if an old man in Adair County could get that much out of a Super M, he ought to be able to do at least that well. That was the highest compliment the man could have been paid. Let me tell you what I take from a story like Eldon Prout's. Not the obvious lesson, not the simple one about old versus new or humble versus arrogant. Those are true, but they're the surface of it. The deeper thing, the thing that I think about when I consider what Eldon did over those 4 years in that machine shed, is patience as a form of precision. Eldon Prout could have put that Super M in the pull in 1983, the first year he began the modifications. The engine was already better then than it had been. He probably would have done respectably. He didn't, because he wasn't ready and the engine wasn't ready, and he understood that the difference between good enough and right was not a trivial difference. It was the only difference that mattered. We live in a time that worships fast. Fast results, fast money, fast opinions formed with fast information. There is an entire industry built on the idea that waiting is a failure of ambition. Eldon Prout would have found that idea mildly amusing. He came from a tradition, the tradition of his grandfather breaking sod, of his father farming through the Depression, of men who'd learned from the land itself that some things cannot be rushed. You could not rush a crop. You could not rush a good engine. You could not rush the accumulation of knowledge that comes from spending 30 years with your hands inside the same machines. Dale Whitmore spent $6,000 to make his tractor faster. Eldon Prout spent 4 years making his tractor better. Those are not the same thing. They will never be the same thing. And here is the last thing I want to leave you with. The thing that stays with me when I think about that September afternoon in Greenfield, Iowa, in 1987. Eldon Prout did not enter that poll to beat Dale Whitmore. He was not there for revenge. He was not there to prove anything to the crowd, or to the salesmen with their Pabst cans, or to the man who'd laughed at his registration form. He was there because he had a job to do, and he had spent 4 years learning how to do it right, and he was ready. That's all. The silencing of Adair County was not his goal. It was just the natural consequence of a man who had done his work, completely, carefully, without shortcuts, finally doing it in front of witnesses. Quiet men have always known something that loud men spend their whole lives trying to buy, that the work is the reward. The pull is the reward. The sound of an engine you rebuilt with your own hands singing at the perfect pitch of its capability, that is the reward. Everything else is just applause. And if you've been out here in this community for a while, you know we've got a lot more stories like Eldon's. Men and women who did the work when nobody was watching, who knew things that no one around them thought to value, who let their machines and their hands and their patient, accumulated knowledge speak for them in the end. That's what this channel is for, that's why we're here. So take care of yourselves, take care of your machines, and if someone laughs at your old tractor, let them laugh. You've got work to do.